Alright, so in my last video on Nietzsche, one of the things I mentioned was the sort of materialist worldview that seems to dominate among Nietzscheans generally. Now that isn't really a fair critique of Nietzsche as such. It's not as simple as calling him a materialist, but the point was that Nietzscheanism, as it's usually interpreted now, leaves this kind of metaphysical void. And what tends to happen is most Nietzscheans, at least the ones I encounter, basically fill that void with scientism and with the sort of typical modern scientism understanding of things. That's basically, again, this sort of materialist, atomistic way of looking at the world that denies truth and value and has this conception of the universe as this sort of blind movement of something called matter, of atoms and particles and something else. And as I kind of expected, I got some pushback from that. And it was mostly people giving, I would say, fairly standard defenses of materialism. But also, what I think is unfortunate is, what I've noticed is there seems to be this kind of weird dichotomy people have in their head where they say, well, if you're not a materialist, that means you're promoting something called spiritualism. I see this mentioned a lot, that, well, spiritualism is more absurd than materialism. I'm not sure what they mean by spiritualism. Maybe they think that I'm presenting some dichotomy where the choice is a theistic religion or materialism. And, you know, bizarrely enough as well, they always start attacking you for being a Christian, even if you haven't said anything about Christianity. So that's another interesting sort of false dichotomy people have created in their heads. And what's very strange about this as well, and the only reason I bring this up just to sort of start this off, is to show how deeply ingrained the sort of ontological starting point of materialism is in people. That even people that are, you know, very much against modern ways of thought, modern paradigms, that they're still, you know, deeply imbibing this very modern way of seeing the world that ultimately, I believe, doesn't have any basis. And what's really surprising to me is that a lot of these people call themselves pagans. Now, there are intelligent pagans with a more sort of holistic, idealistic worldview, closer to something like Neoplatonism or Vedanta. That's obviously a rejection of materialism, but what's interesting is there's this kind of ad hoc paganism, especially among like nationalist circles, where people adopt, people adopt a very ad hoc paganism without really believing any of it, and it just becomes this kind of racial idolatry or something. But their fundamental ontological starting point, you know, their fundamental way of seeing the world is identical to atheist materialists on the left. It's identical to Lawrence Krauss or Neil deGrasse Tyson, and this is fundamentally not a challenge to modernity at all, and it makes a mockery of paganism, because I don't believe that any pagans had that kind of worldview. I think we've lost a lot about paganism. I think Julius Evola talked about this, that we've really preserved a lot of the exoteric forms without that more monistic, traditionalist teaching that generally lay at the heart of ancient religions, that was probably there in the European form as well, that we've struggled to reconstruct. So yeah, this sort of materialist idolatry is very strange and fundamentally irrational. But again, the only reason I bring this up, it shows how deeply people have imbibed materialism, and that it's the last thing that anyone will let go of, even if they've accepted all of these sort of politically incorrect ways of viewing the world, and they've even gone back to ancestor worship or worshipping pagan gods, and yet still internalized they have this materialist, like 17th century way of seeing the world. But I guess, you know, it raises the question, what even is materialism, and we should probably define that. And really, there has been materialism sort of throughout philosophy. You know, people like Lucretius or Democritus. I forget how that's pronounced, but these atomistic theories of the world, you know, matter and the void, And the essential teaching of materialism is basically that there is one substance, that there's this substance of matter that we observe in the outside world, that objects as we see them are constructed by this substance. And then the most problematic part of this theory is that consciousness and subjective experience are also some form of this sort of blind material organization. And by necessity, it kind of denies any meaning to this. There's no higher power, there's no transcendence. It's a wholly immanent way of seeing the world. But yeah, it boils down to this conception of reality being sort of emergent from smaller building blocks that we call matter. And again, this isn't necessarily a philosophically popular way of seeing things. I mean, in terms of philosophy of mind, and this is, maybe for once, this is a topic I can kind of speak with some knowledge on. I actually did my graduate thesis in college on this, and spent a couple of years really interested in like the hard problem of consciousness and philosophy of mind and so on. But this isn't necessarily, materialism isn't a very popular view in philosophy of mind, and the real prominent philosophers of mind really ridicule materialism. I guess its greatest exponent today would be someone like Daniel Dennett, who wrote Consciousness Explained, and a lot of people call it Consciousness Explained Away. And to me, all of the sort of materialist theories of mind are very weak. But that's, I'll get to that. That's basically, I think the main challenge to a materialist worldview is the hard problem of consciousness and an understanding of what the mind, what consciousness is in a philosophical sense. But even just, I think the notion of materialism is kind of problematic and is, from the get-go, and is based on this, again, this sort of outdated scientific revolution way of seeing the world. Every time brings with it a certain paradigm, a certain invention of how the world behaves. And for the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, it was this clockwork view of the world, and materialism seems to come along with that. But I mean, even atheistic writers like Bertrand Russell wrote about this in the early 20th century, that with advances in science, that we've come to the realization that even to define matter is very problematic for a materialist, because it's very hard. No scientist will talk about like enduring substances like maybe some of the ancients would have. Everything is in this perpetual state of decay, of process, and it seems to a large extent that enduring substances are something that we impose on the world as sort of useful fictions. And then I think, again, like the pop science sort of view of this is that, well, beneath objects there's atoms, and maybe that's the building block, but atoms are just constructed of sort of subatomic particles, and then even past that there's quarks and all these kinds of things, and it ends up being defined, again, this is something that Russell talked about, it ends up being defined as created by energy, the particles are. But then, the definition of energy is basically that energy is relationships between particles. So it becomes this kind of self-referential thing where reality is a series of relationships between relationships, and it seems that the sort of final real building block is events. And this was what led Alfred North Whitehead, who was one of the few philosophers of the 20th century that had a deep understanding of relativity and of quantum mechanics, to create this process philosophy view of the world that was based on an event ontology and taking events and process as the fundamental building block of reality, and led him to embrace a kind of Platonism. But that's getting a little sidetracked. But to get back to I guess the point in all of this is that materialism is not an obvious starting point, and I don't think even in this video I'll be able to lay out like a complete refutation and a complete defense of a certain kind of idealism, but what I can say is that the notion that materialism is the common sense view of the world and that everything else is some weird woo stuff that people subscribe to, that to me is the problem. To me, the most obvious starting point is idealism. Idealism is in contrast to materialism. Idealism is the view that matter, the outside world, is either illusory or it depends in some sense for its existence on consciousness. The consciousness is primary rather than matter. And again, to me, this should be the obvious starting point. It's the most parsimonious explanation. As Schopenhauer, as Berkeley pointed out, there's no object without a subject. The only thing we're given immediately is the immediacy of phenomena of our own consciousness. Every time we interpret or interact with the world, it's through our consciousness. And there's some fundamental sort of irreducible subjectivity where you can never get outside of that. In a certain sense, you're always sort of studying, within the bounds of your experience. But this brings up the fundamental challenge, as I see it, to materialism, and this is fundamentally the reason why materialism, I think, is indefensible, which is the hard problem of consciousness. That was brought into debate in the modern form with Descartes' cogito, which is that, I think therefore I am, that you can imagine, this was actually a thought experiment that was done by a Muslim philosopher long before Descartes, the idea of the man that's suspended in infinite space and he can't feel any part of his body, but he still has like the immediate sort of subjectivity of his mind, and that's the same point in Descartes' cogito, which is that you can conceive of, you can doubt everything but the existence of the doubter. There's always there could still be a thought there independent of the body. And this problem has re-emerged in recent times because scientists got very invested in materialism as a way of explaining away consciousness, and they got very invested in the idea that eventually with enough neuroscience, with enough physics, they'd be able to find an explanation that would do away with any hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is basically the existence of qualia, in the simplest terms. Qualia, which is the building blocks, I guess, of subjective experience, the experience of the color red, the experience of happiness, whatever it is, but the subjective part of that, because I've had this argument so many times with people that are very sort of tied up in scientism, and they'll constantly talk about how the experience of the colour red is produced by the interactions of neurons in the brain and neurochemical processes, and they'll talk for hours about neuroscience and about their love of physics. But this fundamentally doesn't explain away the existence of qualia, because there's always going to be a fundamentally irreducible subjectivity to something like the colour red. In other words, I can imagine something in my mind as qualia. I can imagine whatever, a pink unicorn right now that doesn't exist in the world, and that in a fundamental sense is, it's intimately mine. It's not replicable in the outside world. And again, people that are sort of invested in materialism will respond to this by saying that, well, we could make an exact copy of the state of your brain at the minute, and we could reproduce it on a screen. But that would be like mistaking, the map of New York City for New York City, because it is ultimately a reproduction. And even if it looks identical to the way I subjectively experienced it, there's still a sort of subjective thisness to the way I experienced it that can't be reproduced. And there's no way to get beyond this. David Chalmers presented a few more logical arguments for this, which is to take the example of like a neuroscientist who you can imagine has a perfect understanding of the brain, has a perfect understanding of how, say, the color red is produced. But, you know, this neuroscientist is colorblind. Well, one day, you know, they spontaneously develop full color eyesight and they experience the color red. And it's a fundamentally different experience from their previous understanding of the color red. There's something new about the subjective aspect. But Chalmers' best argument around this, around the irreducibility of consciousness, is the zombies argument, philosophical zombies, which is, you know, very simply, you can conceive of some world that's identical to this one, but the people in it, the beings in it, have no conscious experience. We can imagine the world going exactly as it is with me talking like this, but me not having that subjective experience. And there's no, in a materialist understanding, what's the difference between those two worlds? In the materialist view of things, there is no difference, because consciousness is wholly reducible to matter. And so the lack of that, so the lack of qualia in one of those scenarios doesn't change anything fundamentally. Thomas Nagel as well wrote a very influential paper called What It's Like to Be a Bat. And this again gets to this fundamental reducibility, which is that no matter how good our scientific understanding of a bat becomes, and even if we can sort of primitively, you know, with the most advanced computers, we can maybe reproduce something that it's like, what a bat's experience is like, but it's going to be reproduced in a way that, you know, our senses can interact with it. There's always going to be a fundamentally, again, irreducible aspect of what it's like to be a bat or any other being that we can never really access. And the materialist explanations for these things are extremely weak. Again, they'll always talk about neuroscience, about processes that create these things, or else they'll deny the existence of qualia. But again, to deny the existence of qualia, or to say that the experience of something is identical to the neurochemical process that creates it is absurd. But it's a problem for the materialist worldview, because materialism again rests on this fallacy that if something can't be located spatio-temporarily, that it can't be given a physical location in time, that it doesn't exist. And this becomes a problem for things of the mind, for subjective experience, because it doesn't have a physical location. It's difficult to even tell how much of an enduring existence it has. And so what they do is they just deny phenomena that doesn't conform to the materialist worldview, because materialism is a very elegant explanation of the world. It's you know, it's simple, it explains everything, it does away with difficult questions. There's no need for any weird spiritual stuff. And it's very appealing to people that are interested in science, that want empirical answers to things, and that want the simplest possible starting point. But it's not a simple theory at all. If you want the most parsimonious theory, you know, if you want the theory with the least amount presupposed, all you're given is the immediacy of consciousness. That's all anyone's ever been given. It's impossible to step out of that. To talk about substances, you know, the only substance that we ever experience is consciousness. Now, to even add something like matter, to say that the outside world is this separate thing from consciousness, that is somehow it doesn't, you know, the particles and everything else and everything we interact with doesn't have any subjective experience. But it's this thing called matter that we can never experience. You know, we can never experience what it's like, obviously, to be an object with no subjective experience. And that might sound sort of redundant to say, but it's unnecessarily adding this extra substance. And then you get to the real problem of, even if you affirm this kind of dualism, and even if you're to accept that something like matter, something like you know, objects that don't have any form of experience, that aren't in some form related to consciousness, if they exist, then how do you get to consciousness? Because again, you're faced with this problem from a naturalist perspective, which is that consciousness seems to have emerged in the world, through the creation of life and process of evolution. And you get to this, the ultimate problem for materialists is that they have to explain not just one big bang. They don't just have to explain the origin of the universe, which is extremely difficult in a materialist worldview, but they have to explain the second big bang of how and why life emerged, and how matter can sort of spontaneously turn itself into something called life. But to me, the biggest problem of all is the third big bang, which is consciousness. When did consciousness emerge? Because consciousness seems to be something very different from anything else. Subjective experience is something, again, fundamentally different from anything else in the universe. And it's not at all a parsimonious explanation to say that at some point in time, matter crashed itself together in such a composition that subjective experience emerged. That would require a miracle, it would require God, and I think most sort of systems of dualism that require a soul, the ghost in the machine, they're theistic worldviews. And I think that's how you'd need to ground that. But for a materialist, again, they would have to say that even if they acknowledged the reality of consciousness, of subjective experience, that there was some perfect organization of atoms that spontaneously produced it. What was the exact moment that consciousness appeared? Was there a more primitive form of consciousness? And when did that upgrade to the kind of consciousness we're having now? So they get there's this necessary jump that needs to be created from the inorganic to the organic, and then from the non-conscious to the conscious. And it becomes the kind of, you start to realize that this worldview is extremely complicated, and you'd have to imagine all of these things that are so difficult to imagine, not to mention how subjective experience can somehow interact with this fundamentally different substance. How is it that we seem to have intentionality? That I say I'll raise my arm, and somehow, in the outside world, this collection of matter, the arm goes up. So, for this kind of dualistic worldview, you need either, you need a miracle, you need God, or you could just say, very simply, again, that the immediacy of consciousness is undeniable. And why would it not be so that consciousness goes all the way down? Apparently, part of this life form is to have subjective experience, and we would probably infer that about other life forms. Well, why not say that, a proton or an electron has a certain very primitive form of some kind of sort of subjective feeling or experience? And again, this sounds insane to most people that are tied up in this scientific worldview. But to me, this is the obvious conclusion, because it's either that or it's this very hard emergence again, where at some stage the universe created something that was wholly other than itself through randomness. The most parsimonious explanation would be a kind of monism, which has consciousness going all the way down, or an idealism where matter in the kind of the Berkeley sense, subjective idealism, where it only exists in perception. And to me, those are much simpler choices. So this dichotomy that's created, again, where people, you criticize materialism and then people start making fun of stories from the Old Testament or something, or start making fun of astrology or something, or saying that you're a spiritualist or something. It's a very silly dichotomy. I mean, there are many forms of idealism, and most philosophers, most great philosophers, subscribe to some form of idealism, whether that's panpsychism, that everything has some primitive form of consciousness, whether it's the absolute idealism, or everything is the mind, everything is the conscious process of some absolute, call it God, whatever else, Neoplatonism, another form of that, whether it's subjective idealism, the transcendental idealism of a Kant or Schopenhauer. To me, these are all fair ways of seeing the world, but materialism is, to me, one of the, it's not even a starting point. To me, materialism is one of the most absurd ideas ever developed, because it starts with perception, it starts with reasoning about the world, and it ends with the denial of consciousness. It forgets, it starts with consciousness and it forgets itself in this very weird way. And what you get is materialists have a nice theory about the world, and then they have things they're presented with that don't fit with that, and they end up just denying the things that don't fit with that for the elegance of the theory. So materialism is an elegant but unfounded theory, I'd say. And from my perspective, I kind of I go between sort of forms of panpsychism and idealism, but I mean the traditional way of understanding the world is much closer to what scientists are coming to know. I mean, if you read quotes from quantum physicists, be it Schrödinger or anyone else in the 20th century, it sounds like mystics. It sounds like Advaita Vedanta. A lot of people notice this. There's all sorts of sort of pop philosophy books that aren't very good about the relations between modern science and ancient cosmology and philosophy. But you find it in Gregory of Nyssa, the Christian theologian. You find it in Neoplatonism and Plotinus. You find it in Ramanuja, the Hindu theologian, and Vedanta. This idea that the fundamental reality of the world, as Arthur Eddington said, who was a popularizer of Einstein's theory of relativity in the 20th century, that the stuff of the world is mind stuff, and that the fundamental reality is that every individual is nothing but a conscious, an individual conscious agent that is, in its very act of perception and consciousness, is the same mind stuff that is the absolute or God, and that we are sort of partaking in the mind of God. And this is, in various forms, the sort of traditionalist or the sort of classical theist way of looking at things, and you get various forms where the idealism is more explicit or implicit, where you have things like Yogacara Buddhism, which is everything is consciousness very explicitly, and Advaita Vedanta, which is like Hegelianism itself. But this is kind of getting off track. But I mean, again, none of this is really necessary. I mean, you can, someone like Chalmers, who did a lot of the work on these kinds of arguments for the irreducibility of qualia and consciousness. He's an atheist and a dualist. Many other philosophers of mind that have done excellent critiques of materialism are that. But this is all to say that, this notion that materialism is somehow obvious or to be presupposed or somehow conforms to science, these are all basically fictions. They're fictions that we've been sold by culture, by these science popularizers that present unscientific worldviews and impose their own prejudices and their desires to do away with meaning and to do away with philosophy. People like Richard Dawkins, people like Stephen Hawking have a burning hatred for philosophy. They have a burning hatred for the potential of religious faith, of God, of arguments that they can't be a part of ways of understanding the world that isn't inductive empiricism. And I think this is what it comes down to, because ultimately we can turn it back around and we can say that in materialism, not only can the hard problem of consciousness not be explained, but you look at something like truth, and ultimately all our bases for truth are based on mental premises, mathematical truths, whatever else. We seem to have access to these a priori truths, and a final commitment to materialism would deny that process of mental reasoning. Again, it would just be this kind of blind evolutionary adaptive process, and would ultimately deny the possibility of truth. Not to mention that it would deny the possibility of beauty, of moral truths. It would deny the potential for an explanation of the source of the universe itself, for the existence of contingency. But those are 3 or 4 huge other challenges to materialism. But for now, I'll leave it there as far as the hard problem of consciousness goes, which is really the primary reason that I could never accept materialism, and why something else is necessary in how we understand the world. And fundamentally, as Arthur Eddington, I believe, was ultimately correct in saying that the stuff of the world is mind stuff, and consciousness is the ultimate reality.